Welcome. Welcome to University of California, San Diego. Welcome to Eleanor Roosevelt College, and welcome to this, the fourth lecture in the series, The Making of the Modern World, To Be Human. My name is Alan Houston. I'm the provost of the college, and I welcome all of you. I'm delighted to see you once again. Some of you may be wondering, what does it mean to be a provost of Eleanor Roosevelt College? Or more importantly, what is Eleanor Roosevelt College? UC San Diego has this unique system. It is unique in the University of California system of having undergraduate colleges, organizing undergraduates into sub-communities. They're distinctive regions or neighborhoods around the campus. They're united, all six colleges, there are six of us, by our commitment to liberal arts education, to the liberal arts and sciences as the key to any educated and intelligent modern student's life. But each college is distinguished by a particular theme or a mission. If you were at Sixth College, the mission or the theme is the unity of art and technology. If you were at Muir College, it's named after John Muir, and the environment provides the organizing theme. Our organizing theme is global citizenship. Our namesake, Eleanor Roosevelt, was this extraordinary, powerful, intelligent, independent woman who dedicated her life to public service at home and abroad. And one of her most distinctive contributions to the world was her support for and leadership in the drafting and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this extraordinary statement of human equality and dignity and freedom that was articulated and adopted by the United Nations after the Second World War. The college is a community of about 3,700 undergraduates who live together, who share in a series of co-curricular activities, things that express this global identity, who undertake service opportunities around the community or abroad, and who all share this common curriculum, the making of the modern world, the curriculum from which this lecture series grows. It's a 5-quarter sequence that starts with the prehistory, with early anthropological understandings of human evolution, and draws to a close after 5 quarters with the contemporary world, with trying to understand what it means to live as a human, not as an American, not necessarily as a Chinese or a Englishman, but instead as a human in the world that we have today. So our lecture series is an attempt to bring some of the treasures of this undergraduate program, The Making of the Modern World, to you, to members of the community, faculty, staff, parents, alumni. It would not be possible without the collaboration of a number of units around campus. The Chancellor's Associates, UCSD alumni, and Parent and Family Giving have each helped with the organization and administration of this program. It originated in conversations between Steve Cassidy and I last spring. Steve is a professor of Slavic and comparative literature. He was, for a 6-year period, from 2001 to 2007, the director of the Making of the Modern World program. It's that experience that he brought to thinking about this program in this series of lectures. Tonight, of course, he's our moderator, Steve Cassidy.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming again. It's just great to see this crowd, to think that we're bumping up against those fire marshal regulations week after week. It's just marvelous. Thank you so much for coming. Well, we're now in the third of a sub-series of lectures about world religions. And so just to review for a second, a couple of weeks ago, we heard about Judaism. And we heard about a religion that in its early versions gave us a view of being human, where humans were kind of paradoxically presented as being both like and unlike the deity that became a part of that religion. And last week, as we moved to a later iteration of Judaism, Christianity, with Professor Matthew Herbst, we talked about a slightly new emphasis and a new conception. Now, in the conception, as Dr. Herbst presented it to us, to be human is in many cases to be remote from God, precisely because of our fleshly nature. And yet, God, in the tradition, gave us his only begotten Son, to quote the Gospel of John. And that Son, in most Christian theological traditions, not all, is of two natures in one person, a human and a divine nature. We also read in one of the letters of Paul that that Son emptied himself, presumably of his divinity, that he took on the form of a servant, of a particularly lowly human being, was made in the likeness of men, and that he humiliated himself by becoming obedient even unto crucifixion on the cross, which meant that he suffered. And the surest sign of a fleshly nature is the ability to suffer physically. Jesus suffered on the cross. Therefore, we, by suffering, can establish a kind of limited communion with the Son of God. So suffering has a central role in Christianity and has a central role in determining who we are as humans in that tradition. And tonight we're going to hear about suffering in a rather different context. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, let me remind you all of the format that we're following. Dr. Cahill will speak until about 8 and then take questions for about a half an hour. And once again, if you have a question, please do come up to the mics. You may have to tilt them down a bit unless you're quite tall. Speak directly into the mic and kindly ask one question per person. Suzanne Cahill is professor of history. She received her PhD in classical Chinese literature from UC Berkeley in 1982. Served in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. She was at National Taiwan University for a year and for a couple of years as a graduate student at Beijing University. We've been lucky enough to have her here at UCSD since 1984. Her teaching interests: early and medieval Chinese history and thought, women, Taoism and Buddhism, the subject of her talk tonight, material culture, and the Silk Road in Chinese history. She is the author and co-author of 4 full-length books, among them 2 called Transcendence and Divine Passion, the Queen Mother of the West in Medieval China, and a co-authored book called Divine Traces of the Daoist Sisterhood, Records of the Assembled Transcendence of the Fortified Walled City. Tonight she will be speaking to us on suffering, Enlightenment, and Immortality, medieval Chinese Buddhist and Taoist perspectives on what it means to be human. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Suzanne Cahill.
Oh, gosh. Wow, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So the title is Suffering, Enlightenment, and Immortality, Medieval Chinese Buddhist and Taoist Perspectives on What It Means to Be Human. I put my email there because I really would like to hear any feedback, questions, anything that occurs to you later. Just send me an email. And on we go. Okay, so what does it mean to be human? I also want to thank the organizers for asking me to talk about this completely fascinating and totally intimidating question. And I tried to break it down and think of it in terms of my own research interest. And I'm interested in and mainly specialize in a period of Chinese history called the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907. In Chinese eyes, this is the golden age of China. And, China was rich, China was huge, China had a really effective government, very high material standard of living for people. And so whenever I go to China and people say, what do you do? What are you all about? And I say, I study the Tang Dynasty. Everybody from the taxi driver to, researchers at great institutions to the people who give me my hotel key, everybody just gets this look on their face like, the Tang. Which is really great, but it's not like it was perfect. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about, in that period, from that period's perspective, China's 2 major religions, Buddhism, which originally came from India, but then became completely naturalized, so people don't even think of it as foreign anymore, and Taoism, which is China's own native higher religion. I'm not going to talk about Confucianism, although it also has very interesting perspectives on what it means to be human, but I don't consider it a religion. Rather, I consider it a system of ethics and statecraft. So what it means to be a good person, how to be a good person, and how to be a good ruler. Okay, so breaking it down, kind of the question into smaller parts. What is a human being? What are we made of? What's our place in the cosmos? What are our goals? And what should we do? That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And then to sketch what I'm going to talk about tonight, under the general topic of Buddhism, I want to talk about suffering and the particular Buddhist take on suffering. The Buddhist teaching, which is quite scary to most people, of the non-existence of the soul, the privilege for Buddhists of being born human, and the final goal of nirvana, which does not mean heaven, but it actually means extinction. So when the Buddha was asked by his disciples, where do we go after we die? He said, where does a candle flame go after you blow it out? It doesn't go anywhere. It just goes. And then under Taoism, I want to talk about the ideal of becoming one with the Tao or embodying the Tao. Tao means the way. I'll get to that a little bit later. And I want to talk about their idea of many souls that inhabit our bodies, and also other things inhabit our bodies. So I'll talk about those too. And for Taoists, the lifelong goal of attaining human perfection and the final goal of attaining immortality, either literally, individual immortality in heaven, or maybe more metaphorically as becoming one with the Tao, which is itself eternal. And I want to talk about differences between them and end with some commonalities between the two. But first, a couple of basic concepts. In Chinese, the word human, what can we learn from just looking at the word? The character for human being, I just put that in there for fun, pronounced ren, originally meant only nobility. So only nobles and aristocrats were considered to be really human. Everybody else was just kind of draft animals, I guess. Then it was great, later on it gets broadened to include everybody human, and it doesn't have a gender, just like the word human being. There's no gender in that word. It does suggest, though, with the original meaning of nobility, that the idea of social class is really important in China, which indeed it is. China is a relentlessly hierarchical society. I would argue that it still is, but certainly was in the early days. There was never in early China, during the time I'm studying or before, never an ideal of social equality or gender equality or age equality or ethnic equality. In fact, equality was thought of as something very negative, something that would lead to human and cosmic disorder. So if everything was all the same, how would you tell anything apart? It's just a recipe for disaster. Another idea we need to think about is the concept of the individual in China. A lot of times people say, the ancient Chinese had no concept of the individual. And it is indeed hard to talk about individualism in China. Like when I wanted my own private dorm room when I was at Peking University, and I tried to explain that to my friends, I couldn't think of any words in Chinese to say anything but I'm a selfish person who doesn't care about anybody else. So it's hard to express it, but they do definitely have an idea of the individual person. And I think one way to think about it is the individual is like a location, the location of moral choice and of a religious practice and also a personal responsibility. So you're responsible for everything you do, you make choices, and the individual is the one who does religious practice, and that's how you save yourself. A difference between China and the West is there's no concept of the mind-body split or dualism or the mind-soul dualism, which is so built into our Western languages that we almost can't talk about people without talking, without assuming this mind-body or mind-soul dualism. And if we think of this as in the ancient days, going back to St. Augustine, the soul is the prisoner of the body, and then coming up to more modern times, Foucault, the body is the prisoner of the soul. It's just not divided up that way. It's not that they don't have concepts of different parts of ourselves, but we do have lots of parts of ourselves, but we have parts that come together in a holistic system. And in Chinese language, the body is equal to the self. If you read like a series of variations of meditation texts, for example, in one of them it'll say, imagine yourself on top of Mount Kunlun, this paradise mountain. And the next variation of the same text will say, imagine your body on top of Mount Kunlun. So they're interchangeable. Self-cultivation, that is religious practice, is both external, that is, you do it with your body, but it's also internal, that there's internal processes that are imagined to be going on. And this concept of the individual is true both for Buddhists and for Daoists, as well as for everybody else in early China. And then I think I also need to tell you, what am I talking about when I'm talking about religion? That is, what's my definition that I'm working with? And this is the definition I use in my scholarship, following the anthropologist Clifford Geertz in seeing religion as a cultural system that is part of a culture, and it has beliefs, and because of the beliefs that the religion has, in consequence, you have certain values. That is, because you believe certain things are true, then you believe certain things are good or not good. And then you also, certain things make you comfortable or make you uncomfortable, and you think of them as natural and unnatural. So I'm just calling that common sense, the kind of assumptions that we simply don't question. We just take for granted in our culture. So that's kind of where I'm coming from when I'm talking about religion. The oldest layer of religion, just to get us back to before there even was Buddhism and Taoism in China, but it belongs to everybody, and it enters into Buddhism and Taoism when they come along. So this layer belongs to everybody. To be human is, first of all, to be a descendant of your father and an ancestor, a descendant of your father and an ancestor of your children, of your sons. And it is like it's relentlessly hierarchical, it is relentlessly patrilineal. Everything is handed down through the line of the father. Prestige, power, etc. A man and a woman are married when she and he together bow to his ancestors, and she symbolically joins his natal family, no longer as a member of her own birth family. So ancestor worship is the oldest and the most continuous religious practice in China, still going on today. Worship might be the wrong idea. Maybe reverence for the ancestors would be a better one. But ancestor worships assume that some parts of them lives on after death, and also assumes that they can affect us, they can affect our well-being or our lack of well-being, our fertility, our wealth, our health, and we can affect them. It doesn't matter if none of us can affect each other. So we can, by continuously making offerings and bringing them the latest news, we can make them have a blessed afterlife. We can help them to have a blessed afterlife. And we contact them in sacrifice and through shamanism and through divination, also among China's oldest religious practices. So this is there before we get Buddhism or Taoism. So now, moving on to Buddhism, what the Buddha, and that's the word for the Buddha, the Hua, it originally means the historical Buddha, then later there's other Buddhas too, but I'm only going to talk about the historical Buddha and what he taught, and I'm only going to talk about teachings that are common to all forms of Buddhism. So this is sort of pre-splitting into schools, the most basic assumptions of Buddhism. And if you ask, like one of my first Buddhist teachers was this Tibetan monk, and he was sponsored by a New York theological seminary to come to the United States, where he stayed until he died. This was 30 years ago or more. When he was asked, when he came to the theological seminary, he was asked to give a talk, and they said, he said, "What do you want to hear about?" And the seminary, the handler said, "Just tell us your most basic beliefs." He said, "Okay, then I'll tell you the Four Noble Truths." So this is supposedly one of the first things the Buddha said after he got enlightened. And the first one is, life is suffering. A lot of times in textbooks, they try to water this down and say, there is suffering. But it's not that. Life is suffering. And this does not mean that you're miserable every moment. That isn't what it's about at all. What it means is that everything we truly love and care about, including our health, our bodies, our families, anything, is all transient, impermanent, and will ultimately be gone. So you can have moments of incredible pleasure. You can be very happy, but ultimately life is suffering. When this teacher of mine, Ken Rinpoche, when he was done with telling the Four Noble Truths, and he said to his handler, "So, how do you think it went?" And the handler said, "Well, Tibet's a really poor country, and you guys must have a lot of suffering over there, but it's not like that here. and he, when he was telling us this story, he was kind of shaking his head saying, oh, on the contrary, I've never seen such suffering as what I see here. And of course, we have this like prohibition on admitting we're suffering, right? When somebody comes up to you and says, how are you? The only proper answer, unless it's your dearest friend or spouse or something, is, I'm fine. If somebody came to me and said, how are you? And I said, oh, I'm terrible. My husband left me. My son's a no-good bum. I've crashed my car. My dog died. My last book was trash. I hate my hair. If you did that, people would sort of look at you like, oh my God, how fast can I get away from this person? It's not what we're trained to do. So admitting suffering sort of takes jumping over that. But anyway, okay. So next noble truth, there is a cause, and the cause is attachment. If there wasn't a cause, we wouldn't be able to do anything, so it would be like case closed, right? But there's a cause. The cause is attachment. Attachment includes not just that we want things or we're attached to things we love, but it also includes aversion. That's a form of attachment, hating, and also includes ignorance, the ignorance that allows us to be attached. And then the third one, there's a solution, which is what the Buddha is going to teach for the rest of his life. He first preached this when he was 30, and he lived to be 80 and taught it for the rest of his life. And then finally, the solution is the middle way. That is, the solution is Buddhism, what he's going to go on and teach. And then he talks about the Eightfold Right Path, which is about ethics. I'll get back to that later. So that's the first important and difficult teaching. And the second one is the teaching that there's no soul. The Buddha's disciples said, do we have this thing that the people who are going to become Hindus call a soul? The Hindus were teaching that you have this little individual soul, and your goal in life is to unite that with the world soul, and then you'll be in bliss for eternity. So when the Buddha was asked, does this thing exist? He said, no, we don't have that. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. And that was very shocking. But it doesn't mean I don't have an identity or I don't have a spiritual life. What it means is there's no part of us that doesn't change. All parts of us change, and every part of us, physical, mental, whatever, every part of us can be influenced by outside sources. So we're not completely independent of outside influence, and we change. That's how we're impermanent. We don't have this thing called a soul. So then the Buddhist students, of course, said, well, what are we? And the Buddha said, well, we're 5 heaps, and it's the same word for when you sweep a bunch of debris on the kitchen floor into a little pile and you pick it up with a dustpan. 5 heaps, 5 things, mind, body, whatever, that accidentally come together for one life and then fall apart at the end of that life. The Buddha also taught that the material world, in a sense, is an illusion, that is, in the sense that it changes and is affected by outside things, so it's not permanent. And then the goal of Buddhism, of Buddhists, is first to become enlightened, that is, to understand how things really are, and the word for that in all the languages that, in Sanskrit, in India, and then in Chinese and Japanese, literally means to wake up, sort of wake up and see how things really are. And then nirvana is the, final ending, and nirvana means extinction. Another hard teaching. If somebody tells you the final goal to your life is to become extinct, and the Chinese term means annihilation, so it's even more, scary, is like most of us would go, no thank you. But, it takes a while before we're ready to do that, of course. But even though all of this stuff is true, we suffer, we have no soul, our goal is extinction, a Buddhist is grateful every day and says so very, very often to be born as a human, because there's all different things you can be born as. You can be born in hell, you can be born as a worm, you can be born in all kinds of different births, but humans are the only beings. This is the only path from which we can achieve enlightenment and attain nirvana. So even if we're reborn in heaven, which would be great, we get to be really happy for a few thousand years, but we still have to come back and be humans to get off, to escape. And of course, this assumes the idea of rebirth, the idea that we're born over and over and over again. We die and we're reborn, and we re-die and we're reborn until we get it right. And of course, when Westerners got all excited about this, especially in the 60s, everybody was like, great, I don't have to die, I can just come back as many times as I want. How cool, and people started calling each other old souls and all that. Well, it wasn't like that. It was like, think about it. You get born, you have to learn to walk and get toilet trained, and then you have to go to school and learn everything, and then you have to have a job and work really hard and have kids, and then you get old and you get sick and you die. And then you have to do it again. So it's not desirable. Okay. So how do we get to the goal? And there's virtues that are especially prized by Buddhists. Discipline is one. Compassion for other living creatures is another, and wisdom. And those are the main virtues. And then we sort of demonstrate these things in collective rituals of all kinds. That would be the community life of the Buddhists. And then most important of all, individual practice. And we'll find in Taoism too, just like Buddhism, there's many, many, many paths. This is sort of how Buddhism today, breaks up into all these different schools. The schools kind of represent different paths or approaches. So devotion, service, charity, meditation, intellectual analysis, teaching, leadership, all these things can be paths. Now moving to Taoism. Taoism is not about one person, it's about the Tao. And Tao literally means a way or a road or a path. And so it's a teaching about a path. So what, the most important and the hardest question to answer is, what is the Tao? And it's really, really hard to say. And all the Taoist classics just kind of circle around this again and again, trying to find some way to talk about it. But the greatest, or the earliest Taoist classic is called the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and its power. The first two lines of that says, Dao ke Dao, fei chang Dao, Ming ke Ming, fei chang Ming. The Tao that can be said is not the constant Tao. The name that can be named is not the constant name. So in other words, it's really hard to say what it is. Anything you say is not going to be right. So the best thing you can do is try to find a place to look for it. And we can look for it in the cosmos that exists in the sort of structure of the universe. The closest place we can look for it, and this made the Taoists great contributors to early science in China, is in nature, all the regularities of nature, from life cycles of animals and plants to the water cycle, etc. These things show the working of the Tao. And also we all have it in ourselves, and we can find it in ourselves and nurture it. That's what we want to do. The Taoists think of the Tao as the underlying principle of everything in the universe, and it's often pictured as energy or breath in constant creative motion. So the Tao is in everything, so it's in all of us. We all contain the Tao, and all things, the Taoists believe, are manifestations of the Tao. And some of us are just not so clear on it. We're ignorant about it. We don't understand it. But that's what we're trying to get to. So basic beliefs of Taoism: nature is good. Nature is very positive. And we're made of many souls. When the Taoists heard the Buddhists say there's no soul, they're like, well, what do you mean? We have at least 9, maybe 10. We have 3 cloud souls, which are these light little airy things that are super energetic, and they want to fly up to the sky and leave you. They think your body is really slow and tired and holding them back. They just want to go fly around their friends. And then you have either 6 or 7 earth souls, and they're very heavy and tired and damp. And they think you're this flibbertigibbet that's just running around, making them even more tired. And they just want to sink into the earth and sleep. So neither of them wants to be in your body. Neither one of them wants to be there. So a lot of Taoist practice is aimed at keeping them together long enough for you to do the work to become immortal or to become enlightened. We also are full of gods. From the earliest times, the Taoists imagined that every deity that exists in the universe, and one count is 36,000, also exists in our bodies. Since we're full of gods, one of the things Taoists try to do is get them to help us in all kinds of practical ways as well as spiritual ways. They also see the human body as a microcosm, that is a miniature world that replicates the macrocosm. We're replications of the universe in ourselves. We also harbor a terrible problem, which is called sometimes the 3 corpses or the 3 worms. They're also born with us, and they just want to kill us. They just want to kill us. They have no good will at all towards us. So we have to either control them or hopefully stamp them out. And then, sort of saving the best for last, Our essence is this immortal embryo, which is imagined as being born with us, with us, in both men and women, in the middle of your stomach in a place called the Cinnabar Palace. And your job as a good Taoist is to nurture that immortal embryo through your practices, physical and spiritual, so that in the end, that really becomes you, and that can, if you're really lucky, ascend to heaven in broad daylight in front of a whole lot of people so they can be witnesses. Anyway, you need to nurture this to become perfected. Now, a lot of Taoists see this scheme with the souls and the immortal embryo as a metaphor for the process of religious practice and development, and other people see it as quite literal. Okay, so what are the goals of the Taoists? Well, to become one with the Tao. I mean, we already are one with the Tao, we just don't necessarily know it, so we have to realize that. We want to embody the Tao, sort of present the Tao, represent the Tao to the world, and disappear into it and let it manifest itself through us. We want to become, and this language is used over and over again in the Taoist classics, we want to become perfected, that is the best human being that we can possibly be. And this is also called to become a genuine or authentic person. It's also, the term is also translated as a realized one who is realized, one who is made real, one who has become an authentic realization of the human potential. Another way this is pictured is a return to our authentic, natural, uncorrupted state before we learned all this junk that it fills up our heads and just confuses us with all our analytical reasoning, etc. So, and they often compare that to a baby or to a tablet that you would write on that hasn't yet been carved. It's, completely, unlimited potential of a baby or this uncarved tablet. In the end, we want to become a transcendent, often pictured as a little flying kind of human being. But basically the idea is to transcend the limitations of human existence, such as mortality. So what does that transcendence look like? Let's assume we practiced really hard and we got it. What would we get? So for some people, they imagine individual immortality in the Taoist heavens, which are, very crowded. The afterlife is pictured like the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, which to medieval Chinese and later Chinese was the best thing they could possibly imagine, to be a bureaucrat. Everybody who was going to school would be wanting to become a bureaucrat. That was how you'd be powerful, how you'd be rich, how you'd have prestige, how your children would marry well, everything you get by being an official. If I asked my classes, how many of you want to be bureaucrats? You can imagine what they'd say. But if you were going to college in ancient China, you'd be trying to become a bureaucrat. So that's what the heavens look like. Best thing you can imagine. And heavens and hells are both hierarchical, and they're both looking like civil service system. So the heaven looks like the bureaucracy and hell looks like the courts. And nobody wants to be in a court of law and nobody wants to be in hell. And when people had, in early China, after these experiences where they would die and come back, we have a lot of records of those, especially from the 5th century or so, and everybody would be clustering all around, like, so what'd you see? Did you see your ancestors? Were you in heaven? What was it like? And did you see a bright light? And some people would report being in heavens, but other people reported being in hell, and they said, oh, I was in hell. It was terrible. They're just all suing each other down there. So, yeah, okay. But for others, becoming one with the Tao is a little more abstract and assures that we are immortal. Even if our bodies, die and decay and pass on, we're participating in the Tao after death by embodying it and manifesting it, and we are existing outside of space and time. So we become part of the Tao. That's the goal. And paths to the goal, very similar to Buddhism in general form, but taking in specifics, taking different forms. But collective rituals are very important, and then most important of all is individual practice. So again, the idea of the individual as location of responsibility and practice. And practices in Taoism, like in Buddhism and many other religions, dealing with the mass of human, different kinds of humans, practices are very diverse, and also they're graduated. So they start with simpler things and get up to more complicated things. So, they include devotion, good works, especially hidden good works that you do in secret that nobody knows about, asceticism, that is disciplining the body for religious purposes, like by fasting or abstaining from sexual activity, meditation and a special kind of meditation that Taoists and Buddhists actually both do, which is visualization. So those are some of the practices. And then I want to conclude, but not right away, so don't get your hopes up, with the areas in which I see common ground. Beliefs, there's some beliefs that both Buddhists and Taoists have in common. Practices, I think you already could see they have ideas of practice in common. The functions they serve in their communities and the family, they both can be characterized as non-exclusive. They both they very much encourage social activism, and they encourage change. They both talk about change, they both believe in change, and they both change, unlike all these ideas that people have in their heads of changeless China. No, they change a lot over time in response to conditions, historical conditions. And then the last thing they have in common is some parts of their attitudes towards the material world. Some of these things we don't really think of as related to religion, but they're important. So beliefs. Both Buddhists and Taoists believe the world is one and that we are connected to everything in nature and in the cosmos in a holistic universe. The Buddhists have a beautiful picture of this called the net of Indra, one of the old Indian gods, where everything in the world is imagined as jewels that are sewn on at the juncture of the different threads in a net. And so every jewel, even if it's not touching the jewel adjacent to it, every jewel, which is us and animals and everything else, is all connected in this net. And the Taoists have similar beliefs. They also believe that change is constant and unavoidable, and the last thing in the world you should do is be afraid of change. You need to embrace it, and transformation is the way of the world. Individual practice, as I said before, it does focus on the individual, so we need to remember this concept of the individual. Practice is graduated from something like chanting the name of a deity that a peasant can do while he's plowing his field to something that would require years and years of book learning or meditation practice or whatever, and it's very diverse, so there's something for everybody, both in Buddhism and in Taoism. Some religious practice for everybody. How do they function in their communities? Both of them provide services. For example, rituals for rites of passage like birth, marriage, and death. And the priest or monk also uses ritual to help people and communities, to help you with sickness, to help you with situations of disharmony, all kinds of stuff like that. So ritual is a tool that is used to solve problems and bring people together. Also, they answer questions like, what happens to me after I die? Or why is there such terrible social injustice? Why do the evil prosper? Why do the good suffer? How can this be okay? So these difficult questions that we turn to religion to ask, Buddhists and Taoists take a stab at those too. They create communities, so people come together in these religious spaces. And they also, very crucially for early China, they provide a space outside the government and outside of the lineage or the clan, both of which tried to control people and make sure they were doing nothing rebellious or disorderly. So they provided a space for people to gather and support each other outside of the clan, outside of the government, the structures that really locked people into these hierarchies. What else? They're both not exclusive. So this is sometimes hard for people who were raised in the traditions of the people of the book, that is Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who have a very powerful monotheistic impulse. These religions are not monotheistic, so mixing practice is no problem. In fact, it's the norm. I mean, unless you're like a great priest or leader or intellect in one of these things, chances are, if you're a villager, if the Buddhists do good funerals, you go to the Buddhist for your funeral, and if the Taoists do good healing, you go to the Taoist to get healed. It's kind of no problem. It's not like you're not being loyal to one if you go to the other. So they can mix with each other, and they do. They steal deities and titles and rituals back and forth from each other constantly. And they can also mix with older practices and local practices, because China is a country with zillions of little local gods and and so on. These are fine. They don't, neither Buddhism or Taoism objects to these. When the Buddha was asked, is it okay if I worship this god or that god? The Buddha said, oh, fine, you can do it. It's no problem. But it's really not conducive to enlightenment. In other words, fine, go ahead with that if that's your family tradition. But really, the main work is getting enlightened, and that's not going to lead to that. And gods may or may not be present. If you're a Buddhist or a Taoist, you might believe in gods. You might think the Buddha's a god. You might, or you might not. The Buddha never claimed to be a god, and most of his original followers do not seem to have ever thought he was a god. So gods aren't necessary. Ethics, okay. Both of these groups assume ethical correctness of the individual as a precondition to practice. That is, in both Buddhism and Taoism, you have to be ethically right in your family and your community before you can even start practicing. If you are, a murderer or a robber or, just generally a bad person, whatever way you want to think about it, you can practice all you want. It's not going to do anything. So you have to be ethically straight before you can practice. One of the major misconceptions that outsiders or Westerners especially have about Buddhism and Taoism is that they don't teach ethics. They certainly do teach ethics. And the Eightfold Right Path I mentioned at the beginning of the Buddhists is one example, as are the vows that lay people take when they become Buddhists. And then if you were a monk or a nun, you just take like 127 more. But Eightfold Right Path, basically it's the ancient Indian idea of doing the right thing in every single aspect of being a human being. So the Buddha taught what he called the middle way, that is a way between extreme indulgence and extreme asceticism, a way that was in the middle that everybody could practice. But actually, since it involves everything, it's not really that easy. So you have to have right views, that is your opinions, your thoughts, right intention, what you want to do, right speech, every word that comes out of your mouth, right action, right livelihood, like you can't be a butcher, right effort, making an effort in your practice, right mindfulness, that has to do with concentration, being aware of your surroundings, and then concentration. Both the last two have to do with meditation. And the vows that Buddhists take are not to harm things, not to indulge, not to steal, not to indulge in improper sexual activity, and not to drink alcohol. Too bad. Early Taoists, for the early Taoists, we have precepts and prohibitions. We have so many, I couldn't even begin to list them. The earliest Taoist text of precepts, which is stuff you're supposed to do, that has about, I think it has about 60, and the stuff you're not supposed to do is about 150. And later on, they just add more. And then some of them are really specific, like, don't talk to mean people or something like that. Some of them are very small. Anyway, but there are also these rules on correct and incorrect acts. Oh, and the Buddhists also have these really cool little karmic account sheets. You can still get these in Taiwan today, where you can look up any act that you do and see how many points of good karma you're going to get from it, or how many points of bad karma. And then at the end of your life, you tote those things up, and if you have more good than bad, you get a good rebirth. More bad than good, you get a bad rebirth. So making it clear for us. Okay, social activism, another misconception, and this isn't only in the West. A lot of modern Chinese reformers also have this misconception, which is that belief in the Buddhist and belief in the illusory world, and the Taoist belief in everything always changing leads to fatalism and passivity in the face of fate. They accept that the world might be an illusion and also that it's constantly changing, but that doesn't mean we should just sort of sit there and go, wow, too bad. They encourage extremely, with extreme intensity, activity that promotes social justice and involves real-world problems. It's one of the main ways of doing good deeds in both traditions. And just to give you two examples, there's two great centers of what we now call humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan. Huge, and the members of those groups are always the first responders to any disaster, any place in the world. An earthquake in Haiti, the tsunami in Japan, they are the first people there. So that's what they're about. And then another example would be the Daoists, very consciously in the last 10 to 20 years, joining together with environmental movements in China, with the common theme of nature. They want to save nature, they love nature. There's lots more, but that's just a couple. Change. Okay, so they're not changeless. They've constantly changed and adapted to historical conditions, including today. So they're still surviving with these same basic beliefs, but they're surviving in complete, in quite changed situations. So this again goes against the misconception of changeless Buddhism, changeless Taoism, changeless China. And I think material world is the last commonality. Both Buddhism and Taoism exist in the material world as human institutions. They need material support. That is, they can't just live on, spiritual practices. And they're subject to corruption and abuse as any other human institution. There's been plenty of scandals in the hierarchies of the Buddhist and Taoist churches. They have their fair share of that, just like any other human institution. And this goes against this misconception that especially those of us in the West might have, but elsewhere people have it too, that they deny the real world and they're just all about spirit, and they're above material life and above material culture. They're not above it, they're in it like the rest of us. And then the final thing I want to say about being human from these perspectives is that to be human means to suffer and to change, whether you want to or not. But also to have limitless potential for enlightenment and either nirvana or union with the Tao. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. And are there any questions from the audience? And if you don't mind coming up to the microphone so we can hear you.
Stay up here.
Stay there.
Okay.
I'm not sure if my question is a semantic one or a substantive one, but if the Buddha says that we have no soul, and the Buddha says that we are reincarnated a certain number of times until we can achieve nirvana, what is it that is being reincarnated? Is that not a temporary soul, or is...
That's a great question. That's what my students always ask me. That's what the Buddha's disciples asked him. If we don't have a soul, what reincarnates? Well, the actual word that I'm translating soul, Sanskrit is Atman, and Atman means the little germ of the world soul that we each possess according to Hindus. So the Buddha said we don't have that, but he didn't say we don't have anything that can transmigrate. And different Buddhists actually don't agree about what transmigrates. And then there's the other question of why don't we remember our past lives? The Vietnamese have a great folk tale about this, which is that between births we drink the soup of forgetting, and we forget our past lives. But yeah, that was a question, and Buddhists differed over what it is, and differed over what constitutes the person.
Is there a different word for what gets reborn?
No.
Repeat the question.
Is there a different word for what gets reborn? No, there's a lot of different words. They talk about personality, they talk about karmic consequences. One school even says that your acts all perfume you in some way. There's, I guess, influence. And that sort of fragrance is what gets transmitted, or that influence.
I really just have a comment. When you were talking about the goals of the Tao, to embody the Tao, to disappear into it, to let it manifest through us, that sounded so Christian. That sounded like Paul, writing to the churches.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So you see that too?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Suzanne, repeat that.
Oh, sorry. To say that the goal of Taoists, that you want to manifest the Tao, disappear into it, be one with it, sounds very Christian. And I think that I think it does sound very similar. And a lot of times when you have mystics in all different traditions and they report on their experiences of being one with something, I mean, it's so similar. The experience can be so similar, and yet people will when they're describing the specifics of what they're uniting with, they will describe something different. They did this really interesting experiment about 30 years ago with Buddhists, I forget where in Southeast Asia, and Catholics in Hungary, who were they were mystic people. You have people having mystical experiences, ordinary people, and the Catholics in Hungary were identifying, they were in this little village, they were identifying with the Virgin on the altar in their church. And the Buddhists were identifying with a bodhisattva figure just down from a Buddha in their temple. So they had these specific cultural references, but then when they would talk about what it felt like, it was real similar. It seemed very similar to the psychologist doing the survey. Yeah.
Since you were in Beijing in the early opening up years in the early 80s, as compared to now, what is your impression as far as how much these two religions were impacting in the early 80s compared to what they are now?
What's the difference between the experience of the two religions in the early 80s versus now? In the early 80s, people were still recovering from the Cultural Revolution, which had been very, very anti-religious and had smashed temples and images and altars and burned books, etc., as you probably know. And everybody was really nervous about going back to any kind of religious practice. There was also a lot of editorials from the party papers criticizing the waste, for example, of giving your father a great Buddhist funeral. But people were kind of slowly going back to it, and people were also incredibly resourceful. In 1981, the laws governing religion came out in China, and they said, the first part of it says you're free to believe in one of the major religions that is not a cult. You're free to believe, and you're also free not to believe, and you're free to practice, and you can practice, but you cannot teach, including you may not even teach your own children your religious tradition. So, of course, they're hoping it's going to die away. But people are incredibly resourceful, and I'll just tell you one experience of mine. I was in a Buddhist temple in Hangzhou in 81, a beautiful city in the south, near Shanghai anyway. And there was this very eminent monk there who was the head of the Chinese Buddhist Association, and and he also was the head monk of that temple. Somebody introduced me. I was this lowly graduate student, and I was like, trying to come up with some questions to ask him that wouldn't sound just totally stupid. So I asked him a couple questions, and this guy launched into what the Buddhists call a Dharma lecture. That is a real serious, full-on sermon. It was absolutely breathtakingly well put together and connected and logical. And I was just like, wow, I'm so honored I'm getting this Dharma lecture here in this temple. And then I sort of looked around, and there was like tons of people who had all gathered to look at me, ostensibly, because foreigners were still really weird in 1981. But that wasn't what they were there for at all. They were there to hear what he had to say, and he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to them. He's like, wow, here's my opportunity. I can give a Dharma lecture. Because there's this foreigner who asked me a question. So people are just incredibly resourceful about keeping their religion. Now it's much more open. There's a lot of outside resources, and there's a lot of outside pressure on China to protect the religion. And the Chinese have realized that both internal and external tourism is incredibly profitable, and these religious sites are among the main sites people want to visit. So I think there's been opening up. It's certainly been a lot of opening up, while still very watchful and concerned that religion might, in the past, be a source for rebellious thoughts. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Buddhist story?
A favorite Buddhist story? Wow. Well, one of my favorites is the one I told you about, Ken Rinpoche, the guy who gave the lecture on the Four Noble Truths. And another one of my favorites is the other one I just told you. I can't think of anything else offhand. Maybe one of my favorites, okay, this is really Vietnamese, but a lot of the boat people from Vietnam that came on their rickety little boats in the 70s and tried to escape, and many of them drowned, but many of them reported seeing and being saved by the Bodhisattva Guan Yin, who's the goddess of mercy and compassion, the embodiment of compassion. And the Bodhisattva is a being just lower than the Buddha. So anyway, that's also a favorite story.
Well, you had said that during the Tang Dynasty it was very patrilineal. In Buddhism and Taoism, as you described it, the gender issue didn't seem to be there. Is there really no split at all in terms of how they defined a path or good deeds or what's expected of a man and a woman in those traditions?
So Buddhism and Taoism both existed in a social context of extremely patrilineal society and family. But within Buddhism and Taoism, and in early Buddhism, there was some question about whether women could become enlightened at all. And a lot of the early monks taught that you needed to be reborn as a man in order to become enlightened. But as Buddhism goes on, it actually becomes, at least in some groups, much more egalitarian spiritually. So you can think of people as having kind of a schizophrenic existence, right? We're equally worthy spiritually. We equally came, out of the Tao or, whatever. And we have equal potential to become enlightened and escape. But when we go home, we're still in that patrilineal family, and we're still in that hierarchical society. But one of the things I was really interested in studying myself in the past, and maybe I sort of fell backwards into Taoist studies because of this, was that I saw that they honored women a lot. They have a lot of important goddesses, and also that there were great chances for women to be leaders in the Taoist church, and saints and all kinds of crazy hermits and stuff. So yeah, and the practices are very similar. It'll be like, what god are you calling on? There's some differences in practice, but basically they were stealing whatever worked. They steal it back and forth from each other, and they'd say, "I had it first." So there's a lot of commonalities. Yeah.
Professor Chen.
Yes. Hi. Yes, Susan.
Hi.
I'm not quite sure how to articulate my question or comment. When I first came into contact with the central idea of Buddhism, namely that nirvana is extinction, it struck me as something very bleak, stark, and nihilistic.
Yeah.
But when I held that thought long enough, it started to strike me as something insightful and liberating, in the sense that life and death is merely part of the cosmic impermanence, if you like, the flux of nature, if you like. And it struck me as something very liberating.
Yeah.
And especially in contrast with the tradition that I came from, namely Christian tradition. I was born in China into a fraction of 1% of Catholic families. And so I was raised as a Catholic, and I know Christianity inside out, if you want to put it that way, because it seems to me that in the grand narrative of Christianity is sin, punishment, death, redemption, and sort of hopefully life after death, eternal. So life struck me in the Christian tradition as a kind of very a mighty struggle for immortality that may be an elusive kind of a goal compared to the acceptance and, if you like, embracing the idea that we are part of nature. It's very similar to maybe two really iconic symbols of Western concept of life and Eastern concept of life is the following. Nature for the Westerners is something to conquer, to mold to the purposes of human life. Whereas the Eastern culture looks at nature as something that you have to be reconciled to. You go with the flow, as it were. Mm-hmm. So Western culture is symbolized by the Hoover Dam. The Eastern culture is symbolized by a Zen garden.
Okay.
So they're very two contrasting kind of cultures. I hope you can
Thank you.
comment on that.
I couldn't agree more about extinction. The more you think about it, the more it seems very comforting, and it seems also like not so different from being one with the Tao. It's like if you just go back into being part of the universe. But yeah, thank you.
I want to ask a personal question. Having immersed yourself into this history, when you juxtaposition a Western point of view, whose intent is to minimize self-destruction in a sense, is this culture that you studied less diabolical in our own environment?
Oh, is this, well,
Repeat that question.
is it, what?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, is the culture that I study less diabolical than the Western culture? Is that a fair? Okay. Gosh. We're all human. I think we probably create these cultures, and I'm sure that I, in many ways, idealized the stuff that I study. My mom used to always tell me I was reborn from the Tang Dynasty. There was no other excuse for me. But I mean, I think we do idealize the things that we study and want to, in my attempt to make things understood, maybe I make them sound too good, I think that human institutions have terrible flaws, and I just hope we can all survive our systemic flaws together. We have to do it together. The China and the U.S. isn't really, aren't poles apart anymore.
Almost a decade ago, my wife and I visited two Buddhist countries, Thailand and Bhutan. And we were very impressed with how well the people got along with one another. There didn't seem to be, in Bangkok, there were huge traffic jams and you never heard a horn. Nobody ever complained about it. In Bhutan, it's a very poor country, but everybody seemed to be very happy and getting along. Is this a more general characteristic of Buddhist societies? There's been a lot of strife in Thailand for the last few years, for those of us who've been following that. And also in Bhutan, I love Bhutan. That was my dream trip when I finally got to go there. It certainly seems very peaceful and everything, but there's social injustice there lurking beneath the system. If you look at all the Indian women breaking up stones beside the road, being paid nothing and living in these little sort of improvised tents. So, and also then of course China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Burma, Laos, those are all Buddhist countries too. So I don't think we can really generalize about Buddhist countries. We can just take little snapshots of certain periods in history when all kinds of things come together. It's not just what religion is it, but what does the government look like, what does the environment look like, what does the economy look like. I think to get a quality of life description, you need to look at all those things. Yeah, that would be my opinion, not a fact.
At the very beginning of your lecture, you mentioned there is this difference between the Chinese religion and the Western religion. There's no culture. There's no mind, body, mind, soul dualism. Why do you think there were such differences from the very beginning? Was that just some scholars, or there was? What is the reason for that?
Why do I think there's why do I think there's I was mentioning no mind-body dualism in China, and it's certainly so built into our culture we can't even spit out a sentence without assuming it. It's like we assume that I own my body, right, and my mind is kind of running it or something. All those things. And why did that happen? I have absolutely no idea why that happened. I just, I can report that it happened. It certainly has something to do. It happened among religious thinkers early on. That is, we get it in St. Augustine, and we get it in philosophers, and we get it in the Buddhists and the Daoists in China. So certainly it has something to do with how you picture the human being and the role of humans in the universe and the structure of the universe and what our goals are,
In the last couple of lectures, we heard a lot about creation myth and how that played a role in Judaism and Christianity. Is there creation myth in Buddhism or Taoism? When did that first take human form?
There's lots of myths in China about creation, and most of them do not dignify human beings very much. And one of them, the world is created out of this cosmic man who dies, and his bones become the mountains, and all his bodily fluids become the rivers and oceans. The landscape is the most important part of creation in this story, and human beings are the lice on this cosmic man. So we are not God's finest creation in the Chinese view. The Buddhists inherited a ton of creation myths from ancient Indian mythology, but again, it's sort of, humans aren't necessarily the greatest thing ever in either system, and
for the Taoists, it's actually this mechanical process. It's not done by some gods. It's this operation of the Tao, almost as though it's inevitable. Like first there's chaos, and then there's yin and yang, and then there's the 5 elements, and then there's the 10,000 things, which means then there's everything. Even though they do have these myths, but they're not really an important part of any of the religions. Yeah, interesting.
What's the hierarchical arrangement for these religions?
Hierarchical arrangement for their religions?
By nations or areas, or I mean, like the Catholic Church has a bishop.
Oh, how are they organized? Yeah, they do have institutional religions. They don't have anything like a pope that's a central authority, partly because there's so many different schools in existence, and also maybe because no Taoists or Buddhists ever ruled a kingdom. You know, like the Pope actually was a head of a state as well as head of a religion. So there is a problem in that there's no central authority. So, for example, how do we decide who's a saint? That's a big problem for Taoists and Buddhists. You know, they squabble over it a lot, and they do devise techniques of figuring it out. But the hierarchy, you know, certainly you can see it within an institution like a local church or a monastery. You know, you would have an abbot would be the head person, and very organized bureaucracy, very functional underneath that, a treasurer, somebody who's in charge of getting the food, somebody who's in charge of ritual, somebody who's in charge of ordaining and all that. So within each monastery or temple, you'd have a hierarchical system. But there's never a central authority, maybe partly because it was in the interest of the Chinese government to make sure that none of the churches, religions ever had enough power to create a competing, a competing system. Role of the Dalai Lama, well, he's an evil splitter to the Communist Party. And he's a great advisor to Buddhists all over the world. And, you know, in Bhutan, even though they are a slightly different kind of Buddhism, when you ask any monk anything, the first thing that comes out of his mouth is His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, says the following. So the Dalai Lama is important. Yeah.
Is there a concept of a child in Buddhism or Taoism? There seems to be a clear concept of ancestors and of nirvana, but I didn't hear anything about concept of child.
Yeah, childhood is very important, and it's really the period of moral and social formation. So it's a period in which you get taught your religion, in which you learn how you fit in your family, you learn the values of filial piety, that is obedience to your parents and loyalty to the state. The family is the ground. You know, the first education of the child is in the family. So it's moral and social and every kind of formation of the child happens in the family until they're about 6. And then after they're about 6, boys and girls are split up, and they go. The boys are apprenticed to whatever their dad does. So they learn to be a farmer if dad's a farmer. I mean, I'm talking about the Tang Dynasty. And they go to school and learn all the stuff they need to do to pass the official exam if they're going to become a government official. And girls, you know, learn the proper womanly arts that are mostly domestic too. So yeah, there's a concept.
Kind of tying into the tiger mom.
What?
The tiger mom issue of recent time.
Tiger bomb. Oh, the Tiger Mom. Oh, yeah. My sister-in-law gave me that book, and I thought, oh man, I'm glad my kid's already grown up and out of the house, so I would be just so destroyed by this book. You know, nobody thinks she's typical. First of all, she's not Chinese; she's Chinese American. You know, she keeps saying Chinese this, Chinese that. You know, she's just a super type A person, whatever ethnicity she's from. Probably we all know mothers like that, right? They don't only grow them in China.
You had mentioned memory, but there was no concept of memory in reincarnation.
Speaking to the mic.
That there is no concept of memory in reincarnation. Thus, I don't know what I was before, you know, and I'm not going to know what I'm going to be afterwards. So, therefore, why am I concerned with it? What is there in the religion that ties it together? And as you spoke, it struck me that it can only be ethics. Because if I have no personal identity, if I don't know it's me, and the only way I know it's me is through memory. If I have no memory, I don't know who I am. Therefore, why would I be concerned?
Why would you care? Well, it's
and
kind
it
of
have to be ethics.
I think it's kind of a carrot and stick, right? You are being, and this is, sort of on the simplest level. It's like you're being attracted to the good possibilities, even though you won't remember. You still don't want that person that you're really attached to right now to suffer, right? And you won't know who you are when wonderful things are happening. But whoever you are right now, you're thinking, if I'm a Taoist, I want to get closer to the Tao. If I'm a Buddhist, I want to get closer to enlightenment. Then that person, which is you now, wants to make progress. So even though you're not going to remember it, eventually that person that's you now is going to achieve that goal through many, many lifetimes. But I guess another answer is that, you're ethical because that's what you learn to be. There really doesn't need to be a reason to be ethical. We should probably not think we need to be forced to be ethical. I mean, anyway, that's what I think. Just like people sometimes say, why would anybody be good if there wasn't a God? It's like, you need God to punish you so you'll be good? That's too bad. Anyway.
Yes. Do Buddhists and Taoists have any problem with abortion and human cloning the way it is here in the West? And what do they think of the big fuss that we make of it?
It's quite different in different individuals. Just like it is in the West, people have really different opinions, and some people will go back to the Buddhist doctrine of saying don't do any harm to any living beings and say that's an argument against abortion. And then other people will think, well, it's important to alleviate suffering, etc. So you can, just like with Christianity, or other religions, you can pull different parts of it to back up your argument. You can kind of cherry pick your doctrine. There is actually a lot of problem with selective sex abortion in China right now. There's I forget, but in some places there's 120 boys born for every girl that's born. Lots of men are divorcing women who give birth to a daughter, and there's lots. Then there's lots of children in orphanages because the families have given them up so they can, girls in orphanages, so they can have a chance to try for a boy, as they put it. So I don't think there's a single answer you get out of Taoism or Buddhism about stem cell cloning or abortion.
Cloning?
Stem cell research or cloning or abortion. Yeah, not a single answer. Not one answer, that is.
Yes, I wonder if you could say something about the role of prayer in the two systems. And if I could say first, just a few weeks ago I was in Burma and was at a religious ceremony at a monastery, and there was a chance for some questions there. And I asked the monk, when you pray to Buddha, do you expect that he would be able to affect events on Earth? Not sort of a question, but he stopped me very quickly and said, "We don't pray to Buddha, and we don't have such expectations. Rather, it's that we improve ourselves through our thought and affect change that way." So could you speak something about prayer?
Talk about prayer, yeah. Prayer, of course, is in China is much older than either Buddhism or Taoism. We pray to our ancestors to help us. We pray to the gods of the holy mountains and all this other stuff to help us, mostly with quite material blessings like fertility and health and wealth and all that. And in the kind of Buddhism they have in Burma, which is probably much closer to the teachings of the original Buddha, and they call that Theravada, the way of the elders. It's also what they have in Thailand. They are much less likely to deify the Buddha. It still exists, but not so much as in China. So they probably wouldn't be praying to the Buddha for stuff, but regular folk, peasants certainly would. And in China they do too. But prayer, has so many different meanings, right? There's prayer that is really like an exercise in meditation, what the Catholics call centering prayer, but the Buddhists really have the same thing. So it's like you're praying, but you're not really praying because you want a material blessing. You're praying more as a mental process for centering yourself and putting yourself in the presence of something holy and maybe making yourself open descending. So there's a lot of different ways in which prayer gets used, and they're all available to Buddhists and Taoists. And would be sort of divided up by schools, like a lot of things.
I think the translation of the word nirvana into extinction, I think has created a little confusion.
Oh,
nirvana actually is an Indian word, Sanskrit word. And nirvana means no body.
No
stands
body.
for nobody. That means your lack of body, your physical body.
Right.
So when one says that he wants to attain nirvana, that means he doesn't want to have a body. So the question of reincarnation then doesn't come.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the body is, nirvana means he wants to...
No more body.
No more body.
Whoa.
No more mic.
No more mic, yeah.
No more mic.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I didn't touch the mic.
It's just something's here. No.
So I think if we translate properly, probably that question of reincarnation, which somebody said.
Yeah, that's a good
about
nobody.
Memory.
Sometimes
so
it's translated
come,
cessation, so that could be a good translation, to simply cease to have a body. But the Chinese word that translates nirvana is really clear. It means annihilation or extinction. It's the same word for if you have a nuclear holocaust. It's